Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist, used another kind of an image. He said once, when he became aware of the Jungian approach to the psyche, that he realized that Freud was fishing while sitting on a whale. So for me, this was the beginning of 10 years where I was working with these people who didn't respond to any other therapies, giving them a whole series of sessions, and then mapping somehow the territories which were being revealed by this procedure. I believed for a while that I was creating a new map of the human psyche, which was made possible by this new tool. Like obviously the discovery of the microscope revealed new dimensions of reality. It took me a while to realize that the map I was creating was not really a new map, that it was actually a map that in many variations has appeared in many different countries of the world at different times, in different historical periods. I started seeing the similarities to what Aldous Huxley described as perennial philosophy. I started seeing the connections to shamanism. I started seeing the connection to Buddhism, to the different schools of yoga, to Taoism, to Sufism, to the Kabbalah, to Christian mysticism, and so on. And I realized that what was happening is that we were here rediscovering a very ancient map that we have somehow discarded in this juvenile hubris of the scientific and industrial revolution, and that what we have discarded was really a profound knowledge of the psyche and of human consciousness that was developed over the centuries in different parts of the world. So this was a rediscovery of some ancient knowledge, an attempt to reformulate it in modern terms. I try to share some of these observations with the scientific community, with my colleagues, and I very quickly found out that this is not something to be discussed, because the things were so incredible that people who heard it would question the sanity of the researchers. So for about 10 years I worked relatively in isolation, just in cooperation with 3 or 4 colleagues with whom I could discuss these results. We also couldn't, because this was a Marxist regime, we couldn't discuss that these experiences had a certain Freudian dimension, that on a certain superficial level people were having experiences that in a sense confirmed certain Freudian assumptions. And we couldn't, of course, discuss the fact that our patients had mystical experiences in a communist country. That would be end of the research. So we were talking about it as chemotherapy. And we described the diagnosis and the dosages and the number of sessions and the results, and basically kept the essence of this procedure for ourselves. So I didn't discuss these dimensions of the process until the year 1957, when I came to the United States. Now here I joined a group of people at Spring Grove Hospital and the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, which was basically the last group doing still official government-sponsored research of psychedelic, the last one of about 74 that survived these administrative and legal restrictions. So it was very exciting to have a group of colleagues and to be able to do this research and talk about it openly and publish the results. As I was working at the Spring Grove Hospital and at the Maryland Psychiatric Research Center, I was also going to different places, giving seminars and lectures, and my favorite place to go was the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, California, where I was doing 5 days and weekend seminars. And at one point when I was presenting my results, the man who was doing the recording, Paul Herbert, said, "The kinds of things you're talking about are very similar to what Abe Maslow has been writing about." Abe Maslow was at the time a very famous American psychologist who was the founder of humanistic psychology together with Anthony Sutich, and who was well known for his study of spontaneous mystical experiences in people. And Paul Herbert suggested that what I was talking about is the implications of these drug-induced mystical experiences were actually very similar to what Maslow described for these people who had spontaneous mystical experiences. And he suggested that the two of us meet. And so I sent a manuscript describing my work to Abe Maslow, who was at the time recovering after a heart attack in Boston, and he was extremely excited. And he invited me to participate in a small group of people who were trying to lay the foundations of a new discipline, a new branch in psychology. As I mentioned before, Abe Maslow and Tony Sutich launched in the 50s humanistic psychology, which emphasized self-actualization, self-realization, brought in many experiential psychotherapies, emphasizing direct emotional experience and the work with the body and so on. It was a psychology that became very, very popular, attracted a lot of psychologists who were quite disenchanted with psychoanalysis and with behaviorism, which were the two leading schools at the time. But Tony Sutich and Abe Maslow themselves, the founders of humanistic psychology, were now becoming dissatisfied with their own psychology because they realized they left out a very important dimension of the psyche, which was the spiritual dimension. Even humanistic psychology didn't talk about spiritual practice, meditational practice, about mystical experiences, about inspiration, even about things like love and so on. And so they were working on this new school of psychology that they wanted to call transhumanistic. And I was invited to come to several of these brainstorming sessions where we were discussing what this new discipline would look like. And I presented there the findings from my psychedelic research, where I described three categories of experiences, and I will explore it in much more detail later. That basically the psyche, according to my observations, beside the biographical domain and the Freudian individual unconscious, which we find in traditional psychology and psychiatry, has at least two additional domains. One of them I called perinatal, which was related to the trauma of birth. And then I described one large domain, which I called transpersonal. And they liked very much this term, and they decided to replace the term transhumanistic and call this new psychology transpersonal. So it was mostly their merit that they launched this new discipline, transpersonal psychology. They founded the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology and also the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. So I was very excited because I didn't feel isolated anymore like in Prague. I had now sort of a group of colleagues, and we had a certain kind of a discipline which we felt was extremely well-founded, was very culturally sensitive, was sort of making sense out of the ritual and spiritual practice of different cultures, was seeing spirituality as a legitimate dimension of human life. But there was a problem that as much as transpersonal psychology made sense and seemed to be logically coherent, there was a gap between transpersonal psychology and mainstream science, sort of hardcore science, that seemed to be unbridgeable. So very, very profound gap. Transpersonal psychology didn't make any sense from the perspective of materialistic science, and was very vulnerable to being called irrational, unscientific, even flaky. Now, for me then, a tremendous breakthrough happened when I met in a meeting in Tiburon, Fritjof Capra, and I read his book, The Tao of Physics. And I realized that the scientific worldview with which transpersonal psychology was incompatible was actually on its way out. It was being seriously questioned by those who were most responsible for creating it, which is by physicists themselves, the people who were the theoreticians of matter, of material reality. And so Fritjof Capra and I connected. I was teaching him psychology and psychiatry. He was teaching me physics, and we were doing seminars together, which were called Journeys Beyond Space and Time, where Fritjof would take the morning and describe the worldview emerging from quantum relativistic physics. And by the time lunch came, people's minds were absolutely blown, because by the time there were sort of white holes and black holes and wormholes, and time could go forward and backward, and the universe was infinite but enclosed. Time-space could be warped. So when I came with my psychedelic material, it just sank in. It looked, pretty sober as compared to what Fritjof was describing as modern physics.